Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Dialogue. I'm Taimur Shamil. After calling off the peace talks in Afghanistan by the US President Trump, now it seems that the US officials want the peace talks back. Zalmay Khalilzad, the American envoy, has been visiting Islamabad and the region. He has been holding talks with the Pakistani officials as well as the Afghan officials as well. So there is this possibility, many experts think, that the US administration would want to have peace talks back. Taliban too are perhaps looking for a peace talk with the United States. But the bigger question is that what would be the political scenario after, let's say, the peace talks resume, if they resume, or if they don't resume, let's say, the peace talks, what would be the political future of Afghanistan, the US troops in Afghanistan, the Kabul government for that matter, and would the Taliban continue the kind of aggression that they show to the Kabul government and the US troops at the moment? Of course, their biggest clause of what they have been talking with the Americans is that they want the American troops to leave Afghanistan. Now the lockdown is that would the US troops leave Afghanistan and then the peace talks would continue among the different warring Afghan factions, or this would continue, the status quo would continue in Afghanistan. We are also going to talk about Kartarpur Corridor that is going to open tomorrow between Pakistan and India in Punjab. Kartarpur Corridor is an initiative taken by Pakistan, and this is a religious site of the Sikh community here in Pakistani Punjab. Sikh community from the Indian Punjab would be coming to Pakistan to visit the Kartarpur Corridor, their holy shrine in Pakistani Punjab. Prime Minister Imran Khan has said that there would be no passport required by the from the Sikh pilgrims, no visa fee required from the Sikh pilgrims, because this is a peace initiative taken by Pakistan. Also keeping in mind that Kashmir is still burning and Kashmir is under the curfew, Indian occupied Kashmir. The Indian aggression continues in Indian occupied Kashmir. Pakistan's stance is very clear that Pakistan condemns any sort of aggression that is there in the Indian occupied Kashmir, and we want peace and stability. So would India show any sort of flexibility on the issue of Kashmir? Would this initiative taken by Pakistan, the Kartarpur Corridor, bring any sort of change from the Indian side? Would they reciprocate? These are the questions that we are going to discuss today with our special guest. In the studios, we have Air Vice Marshal retired Ikram BHatti, renowned senior analyst on Pakistan's national security and its relations with the neighboring countries. So welcome to the show. Our second guest is, we are joined by Mr. Michael Kugelman on Skype from Washington, D.C. Mr. Michael Kugelman is an analyst on South Asian affairs and particularly on Afghanistan and India. Welcome to the show, Mr. Michael. I'll start with
Thank you.
Michael. We are talking about Afghanistan. This is the longest war, United States' longest war anywhere ever. The peace talks were called off by the President Trump. Now there is a question that is being discussed in the region, specifically in South Asia, that some people might call it a peace deal. Some people might also call it a withdrawal deal, that US wants to leave Afghanistan, and how it would leave would depend on the things that they would agree with the Taliban and how Taliban would agree with the United States. How do you see these peace talks coming along?
Well, I think it's been clear from the very start that the Trump administration wants to resume talks with the Taliban as soon as it can. Essentially, the administration concluded that the deal that it was negotiating with the Taliban several weeks ago was not a good deal for the United States or for Afghanistan because it would not have compelled the Taliban to agree to a ceasefire. And what the U.S. is doing now is trying to intensify the battle on the battlefield against the Taliban to try to soften up the Taliban and get it to agree to come back to the negotiating table and make the type of concessions that it had not been willing to make earlier. And really what the U.S. is going to be looking for is to get the Taliban to agree to a ceasefire before it signs a troop withdrawal deal with the United States. Now, the big question is if the Taliban would actually agree to that concession. The Taliban has a lot of leverage. It is in no rush to sign a deal, whereas by contrast, the U.S. really wants a deal because President Trump wants to get out of Afghanistan as soon as possible, and he'd like to have some type of deal so that it doesn't look like he's just surrendering and pulling troops unilaterally. But I do think the U.S. wants to resume talks with the Taliban at some point soon, and as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Khalilzad has been in Islamabad. He's been meeting with leaders in Europe to try to talk about peace and reconciliation talks. So the effort is ahead. It's going ahead very clearly on the part of the Trump administration. But I think the big question is, if the U.S. gets the Taliban to come back to the negotiating table, would the Taliban make the type of concessions that the U.S. believes it was not willing to make earlier?
Right. This is a very interesting point. I'd put this question to Air Vice Marshal Bhatti. So these concessions from both sides that Michael just pointed to, these are very interesting points. How do you see, Air Vice Marshal Bhatti, this situation going on? Because this is an opportunity, I think, for both Taliban and for the US, as far as I can assume what Michael is talking about. How do you see it?
Well, I think there is yet another reason for the Americans to have called off the negotiations after having 9 rounds. In my view, Michael referred to one, and I feel there is yet another reason for which the Americans have called it off. And this was essentially, in my view, because you would recall that we were having elections in Afghanistan at that time, and the incumbent regime in Kabul was always objecting to and protesting against a direct negotiations taking place between the US government and the Afghan Taliban. And when the American government halts the negotiations and almost calls them off, I think the regime in Kabul gets a political relevance and becomes more important, and in a way the voters do get influenced, and the Kabul regime gets a favorable view from the electorate within Afghanistan.
Right.
And I think the US government definitely has a commitment towards the Kabul regime, and it may be an idea of the Kabul regime or the Americans themselves that for a while they need to call off the negotiations so that the American the Kabul regime looks more relevant politically, and hence is viewed more favorably by the electorate. So that I think is yet another could be possibly yet another reason for the Americans to have temporarily suspended the negotiations. While it was a common understanding and belief that the Americans had called off the negotiations essentially because they were not getting a good deal, and the Taliban were not willing to give whatever concessions the Americans were looking forward to. But unfortunately 9 rounds had taken place, and even after 9 rounds, while we were hearing that 90-95% of agreement has taken place,
right,
and yet this crucial part of the agreement, i.e. as to what concessions the American would want when they want to leave, and that had not been agreed upon. And certainly I think the most crucial aspect would be that the Americans would be wanting to continue to have some presence in Afghanistan, and the difference of opinion must be what is going to be the size and extent of that presence. And the Taliban, I don't know whether they have not been able to convey it correctly, or they maybe have given them some hope to the US, and when it came to the instant of signing, that is where they objected, and hence the Americans halted. But I think this will continue to remain the stumbling block as to what extent, what size, what volume of the American presence the Taliban would be willing to accept.
Right.
But then it's not just the Taliban alone, because the American presence in Afghanistan would not be acceptable to China, would not be acceptable to Russia. And if Taliban do end up having a settlement with the Kabul regime, they come to terms, there is peace, then the American presence becomes irrelevant.
Because this is interesting, because Michael, the debate that is going on here in Pakistan and Afghanistan is there are different scenarios. Let's say if American forces they withdraw, what would be the security situation in Afghanistan? Because the officials in Kabul, they have clearly said that they won't be able to continue this sort of security situation without the American support, without the NATO support for longer period. So security is main concern for the Kabul government and also for the regional countries as well. Do you think that US administration, Trump administration is willing to take any sort of responsibility of what happens after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, I think that as much as President Trump wants to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, I really don't think that even he would want to go to the so-called zero option, where every single U.S. troop and every single U.S. military asset is pulled out. I do think that President Trump sees the U.S. mission in Afghanistan as one that revolves around counterterrorism. And I think that he would ideally want to leave in Afghanistan some semblance of a military presence, really to serve a counterterrorism role, a situation where efforts could be made to keep targeting Daesh, Islamic State, which, as you know, has been quite resilient in Afghanistan, and also to push back against the remnants of Al-Qaeda, because, you know, what you hear so frequently from U.S. government officials is this concern that if the U.S. leaves Afghanistan, that Afghanistan could revert to what you had in the late 1990s, where it was this huge terrorist safe haven, and you had terrorists that were involved in planning the 9/11 attacks. So certainly the U.S. government is concerned about the ramifications of a full withdrawal, and I think even President Trump, as much as he wants to end this endless war thing, that, as he puts it, I don't think that he would want to pull every troop. I think he would want to keep some U.S. military forces there. But the big question is if there could be a deal with the Taliban that would allow that, because the Taliban has been very clear that if it signs a troop withdrawal deal with the U.S., it wants every single U.S. troop out of the country. So that clearly is going to be a challenge for negotiations moving forward.
And right, and talking about, let's say, other countries in the region, as Air Vice Marshal Bhatti just mentioned, that if there is this presence of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, Taliban might not accept it, or they might accept it. Do you think that other regional countries would accept the American presence for a longer period in Afghanistan? Right. Michael, can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Sorry,
right.
yeah.
So do you think that other countries in the region would accept the U.S. presence in Afghanistan? Taliban might accept, let's say, as you said, or they might not accept. But what about the other countries in the region?
Well, you know, I think there's certain clear answers. Like India, for example, I think would much prefer to have a continued U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. And I think that even many other countries, including the ones you mentioned, Russia and China, I mean, they have their own interests for wanting to have U.S. forces there, because I think they would recognize themselves that even though the U.S. is a rival, you know, the U.S. security presence and the broader NATO security presence that comes with that does help promote a small modicum of stability in Afghanistan. And that's important because China wants stability in Afghanistan so that it could build out its Belt and Road Initiative. Russia wants stability so that it doesn't have to worry about the ISIS threat and so that it doesn't have to worry about the drug trade. So, you know, whereas you may have a lot of public rhetoric from some of these U.S. rivals, particularly the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians for that matter, I do not think that at the end of the day, the governments of these countries would necessarily be really unhappy if the U.S. were to maintain a residual military presence for quite some time. Now, again, but the issue comes down to how feasible that really would be. I just don't know if the U.S. would be able to work out a deal under the current scenario where you could have some type of residual military presence that allows you to have several thousand U.S. troops on the ground to provide a training and advising role, to play a counterterrorism role, and also to maintain some kind of intelligence presence. And that's going to be really important too.
Right.
Can I have a question?
Please.
Well, I agree with Michael to an extent that every country in the region, be it China, be it Russia, be it Iran, be it Pakistan, be it even India, they are all interested in a peaceful Afghanistan. And when the Americans, for example, let's suppose they withdraw totally, then of course, who will guarantee peace and security? So there has to be a force till Afghanistan becomes self-sufficient in maintaining law and order or writ of the state, and it becomes stable and peaceful. Till that happens. So if the presence of the American troops is not acceptable to the Taliban, my question to Michael would be, how would the Americans view if an option of a contingent of UN forces is placed over there to ensure the same, which renders a satisfaction to the regional countries in terms of ensuring security, stability, right, and any operation that has to take place against any terrorist elements that continue to remain over there.
Well, this is a good point. Michael, what is your take on this? Because also this union of forces, as you were calling it, Air Vice Marshal Bhatti, US and the NATO forces, they have doled in so much money, they have pumped in dollars for the last 18, 90 years. Kabul government has not been stable since 18, 19 years till now. Do you think that any future coalition, let's say, or support to the Kabul government would make Kabul government stable? Do you see some sort of political stability coming in if all the regional countries and the international countries support the Kabul government?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, you go back a few years and look
hear
at the height of the U.S. troop surge, when you had more than 100,000 U.S. troops and about 150,000 NATO troops on the whole on the ground in Afghanistan. And did the situation stabilize? Well, not really. To an extent, yes, but not really. So that sort of raises the question, if you're talking about a smaller presence, which now is 14,000 U.S. troops, several thousand from other NATO countries, can that really make a difference? And I think that gets to an important psychological dimension here. I really think that even if you're talking about small numbers of troops, as you have now, I think that provides a level of reassurance, psychological reassurance to the Afghan government, the Afghan military, which has feared for many years that eventually you would have an abandonment, that the U.S. would abandon Afghanistan, as of course happened another time in history. So I think that maintaining even a small presence of troops can serve a psychological benefit for Afghan forces that could suffer major morale-related implications if you have a full-scale withdrawal, and if you have these morale problems within the Afghan security forces, that could have battlefield impacts in the sense that you would have more troops that just don't want to fight, that want to desert, and all that. But one final point to make here, which is important to have in this conversation, we could talk about a withdrawal of U.S. and allied forces from Afghanistan. But what I would really worry about for the sake of stability in Afghanistan is not as much the withdrawal of foreign forces so much as the stopping of foreign funding from going to the Afghan security forces, because they're so heavily dependent on the international community. If the Afghan security forces are no longer getting money from the international community, then you really have to worry that they could simply collapse. And that's when you really have to worry about big problems in Afghanistan. So I think it's important to make that decision of a withdrawal of foreign forces as opposed to a withdrawal of foreign financial support for the Afghan security forces.
Right. BHatti, this, let's say, foreign funding to the Afghan forces, this has been going on for the last couple of years. I just told you, 18, 19 years for that matter. But there have been reports of massive corruption in Afghan security forces. They have not been able to take control of much of the area in Afghanistan. There has been killing going on. A lot of also covert operations in Afghanistan that have been killing innocent people in Afghanistan. And this sort of support can continue, and so can the war continue in Afghanistan. What is, let's say, the end to such kind of supports and funds? Can this end the war in Afghanistan?
You see, for a while we know that the Kabul regime or the Afghan government is not going to be in a position to handle the security situation in Afghanistan by itself. It will need assistance. And I think peace cannot return to Afghanistan unless there is intra-Afghan dialogue and acceptability of each other. The Kabul regime accepts the Taliban position, and the Taliban are prepared to accept the Kabul regime as a stakeholder in the country. And I think true peace, prospects of true peace will only emerge after that happens. And of course, even if there is settlement between the two, Taliban and the Kabul regime, and they decide to share power, and there is no conflict between the two, I think even then we have a very real threat, that is of Daesh in Afghanistan, which is going to continue to remain there. And when the two join forces together, I think it will be much easier for them to tackle the Daesh as a threat. But the fact remains that they will continue to need international support in terms of financial assistance, security assistance. And if my question to Michael was that if the Taliban are not prepared to accept the American presence, then would the Americans be willing to consider supporting a UN presence, and they continue to provide the necessary military support or financial support, so that that element or that contingent of the UN forces is brought into Afghanistan, and that provides the necessary military strength and expertise to meet any security situation that does emerge in Afghanistan.
I think Michael just I think mentioned that and gave the response that if the funding continues, that might boost the morale of the Afghan security forces. But Michael, this point that Awaz Marshal Bhatti has raised up, the issue of Daesh, ISIS, Baghdadi got killed. Now the situation in Syria and in Afghanistan, Daesh in Afghanistan, how do you see the presence of ISIS in Afghanistan and also in Syria, Afghanistan specifically at the moment?
The Air Marshal makes some great points right there. On the issue of this idea of a UN force in Afghanistan, certainly in principle the Trump administration would support that, just because President Trump himself has spoken so long about the need for other countries to step up their game and do more to help the U.S. fight these wars. So theoretically, President Trump should be delighted at the prospect of some type of UN coalition to be on the ground in Afghanistan. Problem is, as you know, the Trump administration is not the biggest supporter of the United Nations. So I think that what President Trump would much prefer is to have other NATO countries increase their own contributions in Afghanistan. The problem is that NATO capitals, other than the U.S., are extremely hostile to the idea of an extended troop presence, even more hostile than the U.S. public is. So that could be a challenge. On the Daesh question, absolutely, that's a critical issue right there. My argument is that the death of Baghdadi will do very little to affect the presence of Daesh in South Asia, which, as you know, is mostly in Afghanistan. One thing we've seen with Daesh over the last few years is an ability to create and nurture fairly autonomous affiliates outside of the main so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq that have been able to thrive and operate on their own. And I think that's what we're looking at in Afghanistan. This is an affiliate that has already managed to be quite potent and destructive, even though it has been hit by Afghan and U.S. airstrikes for a number of years, even though the Taliban is fighting against Daesh on the battlefield in Afghanistan. It's remained resilient, and I think that will continue to be the case. And I don't necessarily see this big blow to ISIS Central, to Daesh Central, in the form of the death of Baghdadi, will have any impact on the ability of Daesh to operate in ways that it has in Afghanistan. So I see this certainly as a big challenge for the U.S. moving forward. And as I said before, the U.S. government looks at its mission in Afghanistan largely through the lens of counterterrorism. And this is a group, Daesh, that may not be the biggest militant threat in Afghanistan, because the Taliban is, but it is certainly a very resilient affiliate of Daesh, and it is a group that has consistently threatened to target U.S. targets, and not just in Afghanistan, but beyond Afghanistan as well. So this will remain a really big challenge and a conundrum for the U.S. in Afghanistan moving forward.
Right. And Awaz Marshal Bhatti, do you see Daesh now as a challenge? Because many people are of the view, experts are of the view that Taliban are a bigger force. They have been rather fighting this coalition forces there in Afghanistan. ISIS wouldn't be much of a challenge for the Taliban, or do you see that this might come up as a challenge?
Well, you see, when you look at the composition of ISIS or its fighters in Afghanistan, a major component of them are either ex-Taliban, they are ex-TTP, or they are ex-Uzbek or whatever. So, and there are very few who are from Middle East. So I think while the Americans and the other countries have been fighting Daesh militarily, I think Daesh also presents an ideological challenge. And when you look at the victims of ISIS, I think 80 or 90% of the people that they have killed are Muslims. So I think it's a challenge for the regional countries more compared to what it is to the Americans. And the regional countries will be far more, or should be far more, interested in dealing with it. And I think it is a challenge for the Muslim countries specifically to meet and beat the Daesh on the ideological front. They should be able to educate and convince their own people as to what are the aims and objectives of Daesh, and they should be able to dry out any financial or even ideological support or sympathy towards Daesh, and I think Daesh will die his own death.
That's right. We are going to continue now our discussion on Pakistan-India relations. Kartarpur Corridor is going to open tomorrow, and the Sikh pilgrims are going to visit Pakistan to visit their holy shrine in the Pakistani Punjab, Kartarpur Sahib, where the founder of Sikh religion, Baba Guru Nanak, was born. Prime Minister Imran Khan has said that this is a Pakistani initiative for peace and stability. There is no visa fee for the Sikh pilgrims. There is no passport required by from the Sikh pilgrims. This is a Pakistani gesture for peace and stability. Some of the Indian officials would also be coming tomorrow to open the Kartarpur Corridor. Obviously, this is going to be an official ceremony. But the thing is that would India reciprocate Pakistan's peace gestures? Because in India we see BJP government ruling, the Hindutva rising, the saffron tide in India, the aggression in Kashmir continues. Kashmir is still in the lockdown, is under curfew. How would India respond to Pakistan's peace overtures? After this break, stay with us.
Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to another episode of Dine with World. My name is Amina, and with us we have Chef Carlo. It's called a double boiler, right?
Yes.
So we are making chocolate ice cream gelato al chocolato. Great. Wow. You have pasta every day?
Yes.
Yeah, and you too?
Yes.
In the end, you're going to add parmesan and then you blend it. I would love to try tortellini. Don't burn yourself. It just feels like heaven, you know? Wow, that's a beautiful color. This is also buco, and it's very simple to make.
Welcome back. Pakistan has taken a peace initiative of opening Kartarpur Corridor with India. The Indian Sikh pilgrims would be visiting Pakistan, Pakistani Punjab, Indian Punjabi Sikhs would be visiting Pakistani Punjab. And this is an initiative to show peace and stability that Pakistan stands for in the region. Michael, talking about this opening of Kartarpur Corridor that is going to take place tomorrow officially, that is going to open tomorrow, how do you see this Pakistani gesture of peace and the Sikh pilgrims visiting Pakistan, also keeping in mind that the Pakistani pilgrims, Sufi pilgrims, cannot visit India at the moment? How do you see this?
Well, I think it certainly is a very good thing on a very basic level, given how dangerously tense the India-Pakistan relationship is right now. Any type of gesture like this should be applauded and ideally reciprocated by the other side. I fear, though, that the way that the Indian government is going at this point, it does not really strike me as an administration that has any interest in any type of conciliation on any level at this point. Now, if you consider what we're having with this corridor that's going to be opening tomorrow, it seems like a purely humanitarian thing. It's benefiting religious pilgrims. There's really no reason why India should not be supportive of something like this. But again, this is a government that is taking a very strong and recalcitrant stand when it comes to relations with Pakistan right now. And I just don't see the Modi administration as the government that's going to want to move forward on this front. At least not right now. Maybe give it some more time. Let's hope that I'm wrong, and let's hope that India will reciprocate in the spirit of humanitarianism and in the spirit of doing a humanitarian gesture. But beyond that, I don't see this as any type of bigger opening for better relations between the two countries. I don't see it as any type of opening for formal dialogue or anything like that. India has made it very clear by repeating mantras like, no talks with terror, and things like that, that it really is not interested in moving forward. And the message from the Modi government is that it tried to extend an olive branch to Pakistan when Prime Minister Modi first became premier the first time in 2014. And the argument there is that he tried, it didn't work because the Pakistan side was not interested, and that's where we are now. So I unfortunately am a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the immediate future of dialogue between India and Pakistan. I think that the Kartarpur Corridor issue is a welcome one, is a good one, but I don't necessarily see it as something that's going to bring momentum to the broader relationship and allow the two sides to try to sort of walk back from the brink, so to speak, that they've been facing over the last few months in terms of the deep tensions in the relationship.
Right. Marshal Bhatti, optics are very important when it comes to international politics, international relations. While Pakistan has opened this Kartarpur corridor for the Sikh pilgrims, just 2 days back, 27 MPs from the ultra far right, European MPs, were visiting India. They were taken to Kashmir. We are taking this initiative, a peace gesture, and what we see as more sort of ultra far right nexus of the Indian far right and the European far right. How do you see these two optics?
Certainly, as you said, there are clearly distinct character and nature of the two activities that are happening in quick succession. And as you were just talking, that religious freedom and facilitation of performance of religious rights, they are the duties of any democratic government. And in fact, the opening of this corridor was a long outstanding action that should have been done. And unfortunately, the Indian side did not view it as such. But the very nature of this proposal by Pakistan was such that because of these extreme sensitivities of their own very important minority, the Sikh community, the Indian government had to accept it. They just could not afford to refuse it. And even if it was with Pakistan, because they were not willing to talk to Pakistan, or negotiate at any level, because they had maintained that it is Pakistan which is causing this terrorism in Kashmir, and they were not prepared to enter into any dialogue. And here it was an offer by Pakistan which they just could not turn down. They could not afford to politically, because of domestic compulsions and politics. So they agreed. While they did drag their feet, and they did raise several objections and made several observations. They even tried that this bridge on river Ravi, almost a kilometer long bridge, does not get made within the required time. They even let a lot of water to be released in the river, so that the construction process is delayed or obstructed. But Alhamdulillah, the work went on, and the bridge was ready on schedule, and inshallah tomorrow we will have the opening. And I think we are talking about optics. This has gone on very well with the entire world, that here is Pakistan, who despite all the tension is prepared to continue to give peace a chance and opportunity. And I think it will be very difficult for Indians to desist such a opportunity, and and there is a remote possibility that it may create some sort of opening of a door where some sort of communication can take place. But as Michael was saying, it is remote, because Kashmir and Kartarpur, I think, are mutually exclusive. Indians have taken a very hard position on Kashmir, and the kind of rhetoric, the kind of momentum that they have built within India is such that even if now they want to, it will be very difficult for them to pull back and change their narrative and bring about peace in Kashmir.
Right. Michael, my last question to you. This rise of Hindutva, the saffron tide in India, the situation of the minorities in India, how do you see it? Do you see things getting better in India? Sikhs would be visiting Pakistan, but the rise of Hindutva is right there. This is a threat not just for Pakistan, but for the regional countries, and specifically for the Indian minorities. How do you see it?
Yeah, it certainly is very concerning. And I mean, as you know, the BJP has been in power before. This is not the first time. It's always been a Hindu nationalist party. But what we're seeing from the BJP this time around is a particularly toxic brand of Hindu nationalism, of Hindutva. And I do worry. I think for domestic political reasons, the Modi government will want to pursue this social agenda, this Hindutva agenda, very aggressively. I think really to maintain support and backing. The Indian government knows that there is a significant jobs crisis. It knows that it's going to need to try to push through some very difficult economic reforms. And it worries about the support it could lose. And I think that for the Modi government, the idea is to try to put the foot on the accelerator of the social agenda in order to insulate itself from the political vulnerability that could set in when it pushes forward on the economic side. And my point here is that for many, if not most Indians, this Hindutva strategy is something that's very popular. We know that the revocation of Article 370, which I see is intertwined with the Hindutva strategy, it was extremely popular across India. And some of these other measures that are being considered as well are popular across India. So my bottom line is that I do think we're going to see the Modi government continue to pursue this social agenda very aggressively. For one reason, just because that's what this party has always wanted to do, is elevate the position of Hinduism in state and society, but also for political reasons, to insulate itself from the harm that could set in if it tries to push forward with some unpopular economic reforms to deal with this jobs crisis. So I do think we're going to see the status quo continue in India for quite some time with this issue of Hindutva.
Right. Michael, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. It was Mashal Bhatti. We were talking to Michael, and this point that he raised is very important. This toxic brand of Hindutva in India, and the way they are overcoming the space of the minorities that are there in India. Opening this Kartarpur Corridor is another way to give a breathing space to the Indian minorities, let's say, or generally to peace and stability in the region. How do you see it?
Certainly, you see, because when the RSS based BJP government is willing to accommodate the sensitivities of a minority, that means that they are not blind to the sentiments of their minorities.
Right.
And if they can afford to politically, they can of course sideline them, but if there is a threat, a political threat or a security threat, they would certainly want to accommodate. That is what is happening in the case of Kartarpur, that they are more mindful of the sentiments of the Sikhs, because they know that they are very deep rooted in Indian society and Indian security network, in their economy, and losing their support would cause a very serious setback in India. Hence, they are prepared to much against their narrative, talk to Pakistan, accept the opening of the corridor, and allow Sikhs this religious pilgrimage, which does show a ray of hope that after all Indians can be mindful of the sensitivities of their minorities. But of course, the minorities have to be so well placed that they can be a serious concern for India. Only then the Indian government would be willing to take a notice of them.
It was Marshal Bhatti. Pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for joining us. Pakistan has taken an initiative to open the Kartarpur Corridor. The Indian Sikh pilgrims would be visiting Pakistan tomorrow. Tomorrow would be the official day of the opening of Kartarpur Corridor. We welcome the Sikh community who would be visiting Pakistani Punjab, Kartarpur Sahib. Pakistan stands for peace and stability. We welcome them all, and we hope that peace and stability prevails in the region. But at the same time, Pakistan is also prepared for any kind of unprovoked aggression from the Indian side and any misadventure from the Indian side. We stand for peace, but we also know how to give a befitting response to any unprovoked aggression from the Indian side. Thank you for watching today's show. See you next time. Khuda Hafiz.